No, don't.
The First Omen is a new nun-centric horror film released in 2024 that follows Nell Tiger-Free as Margaret, a young woman from Massachusetts who arrives in Italy to work at a convent where she starts noticing strange, eerie things occurring, and where she learns of a deep conspiracy existing within the church, which she must work to uncover before it's too late. Now, this film was a real surprise to me, and in all honesty, until a few days ago, I did not even know this was connected to the Omen film franchise, because The Omen is a 1976 supernatural horror film that, when you compare to a lot of other horror classics like The Exorcist or Halloween or Scream or Friday the 13th, or even Psycho, which is due for yet another remake pretty soon, it just doesn't get that kind of love. People don't talk about The Omen as much. And while in the 70s it was probably a pretty big deal, starring Gregory Peck, scored by Jerry Goldsmith, and directed by Superman's Richard Donner, today it just kind of has faded into horror film obscurity, mostly due to the fact it was kind of slow-paced, and when people think of demonic children horror movies in the 70s, they really just think of The Exorcist. And because all 5 of the sequels and that one prequel were pretty terrible, no one cares. And I was trying to wonder why 20th Century Studios, who owns the property, thought, oh, let's remake The Omen or make another entry in the series. Like, what prior audience do you bring with it? What kind of following do those films have that would make people want to see this film? It seems like it would only be a relatively small amount of people, since The Omen really isn't talked about that much. And I guess it doesn't really matter, because The First Omen is a really good horror film. And unlike, let's say, recent pieces of shit like the new Halloween trilogy or Exorcist Believer, this film takes a franchise and breathes new life into it. It doesn't really need to even be part of a franchise, and yet it still works. It still functions mostly on its own, which is its strongest benefit. Whereas Halloween and Exorcist 2023 are both broken pieces. It leans so heavily on callbacks and those mandatory references, it ends up breaking what could be a pretty memorable movie. I mean, these films treat Jamie Lee Curtis and Ellen Burstyn's role like they're a cameo appearance in an MCU film, and it ends up just taking away from the movie you came to see. It lowers the bar, it lessens the immersion, it makes you feel like what you are watching is not just a bad movie, but a hollow version of something better. Where The First Omen is actually incredible. It actually stands on its own while fitting into said universe this studio owns. And it actually makes a new name for itself as a great movie without needing any references to the past for the most part. It's really well paced, it's eerie, it's well acted and shot, it's very interesting and creepy, and most of all, it's original and stands out. So today let's break down what makes The First Omen so good as a modern studio reboot of a horror franchise where other films have failed. So for the first part, the story here is pretty whole. One of the reasons The First Omen works is it tells a story on its own. The film does not rely on cheesy callbacks or making sure you've seen the prior Omen films, and this is a good film as it shouldn't need to rely on these tropes. A lot of movies now introduce these legacy characters, like I mentioned before with Jamie Lee Curtis or Ellen Burstyn. They try to make you think of the first movies, but sometimes that just takes away a lot because we are trying to build a foundation here, and you can't really build something new if you're still stuck in the past. Sometimes there's a really good reason to do this. Maybe you have a great actress and you really want to use them, but you really need a good story to be able to make those story elements work. Movies shouldn't really rely on these tropes unless you're making the final installment in an epic trilogy, and understandably, this movie doesn't need to do any of that since they kind of know people haven't really cared since 1976. And the fact that this movie just has some musical callbacks and brief leitmotifs, as well as a single piece of dialogue that's a callback to the very famous line, "It's all for you, Damien," it really just works well, and it doesn't take away too much. It doesn't overwhelm you. It works. It's still a film that stands on its own, because it doesn't rub in your face that there are other films that came before, and because of that, this can exist on its own. This is also a real movie to me. Another thing that works really well in this film is the structure. I mean, this is something that most movies, no matter what the genre is nowadays, really struggle with. And this film gets off the ground without a hitch, immediately. And this is what the problem with not only most modern horror films are, but movies in general are, and that's just a lack of decent structure. This film is just a real movie, and I think an easy comparison here would be Immaculate, which has almost the same plot. an American nun arriving in Italy to work for a convent, only for strange things to start occurring, and the general plot of a church trying to give birth to the Antichrist through said nun. It's the same plot, almost beat for beat. But there's something that goes harder here. Something is more real and dangerous in The First Omen. And you can check out my review for Immaculate, but it was very clear upon watching that movie that it was just a silly, cheesy, and almost easy movie that didn't have that deep a plot. The villains in that were almost caricatures. The story was incredibly quick and simple. That pacing was very rushed. I mean, the film was only 89 minutes, and while some people may have liked it and thought, it's an easy, simple horror film, it was also just not that scary and relied on cheap gore to give you those scares. Immaculate is just very straightforward in a way The First Omen is not, and that's honestly not a good thing for Immaculate. I think it's better that this movie isn't so straightforward, that it has these twists and turns. It still has plots you might have seen before in other movies, but it does something new with that. In fact, The First Omen is more scary because of how structured it is, and how it allows tense moments to build up and leave you waiting for shocks later. Take the openings of both films. Immaculate opens with some unnamed nun on the run from a church at night. You know something bad has happened to her. You know she's afraid. You know someone's chasing her. She runs out of the church grounds and gets confronted by these masked nuns, and then she wakes up in a box and is screaming, only to find out she's been buried alive. Roll title card, and the movie begins. It's pretty spooky, right? Well, yes, but not as creepy as it could have been. And this is where The First Omen is better. Now, the opening for this movie really isn't as uncomfortable, it isn't as straightforward, and it doesn't delve straight into the horror. I mean, the opening is set in the daytime, and even the musical notes are somewhat light and less ominous, but that's exactly why it works. The film opens with this priest walking to a church which is under construction. We get this meeting between two priests who are discussing something we have no idea about. They're talking about something bad that will happen, and it's setting up the plot. Then we get this really cool imagery of these construction workers raising up a religious painting on a pulley, which eventually snaps and breaks, and the glass and materials fall hard enough to badly injure this one priest who doesn't even know he's been hit until he turns around and we see just how bad this injury is. Now, it might seem like a gross out reveal, but there's just something more menacing here with how the priest just smiles and walks away, and how the music is almost light and soothing. It leaves more to be desired, but since this is the beginning of the film, it works. It leaves you wondering what is going to happen, what the priests are talking about. This imagery, too, is very original and creepy, whereas in Immaculate, it's just a creepy and almost kind of really tight setting, but that doesn't do much. I mean, it's claustrophobic. Yes, she's put in a box underground, but okay, she's being buried alive. That's it. There isn't really much more to that. Why did the painting fall in the first place? Why did the priest seem almost complacent with nearly being decapitated? Was there something supernatural involved? What is the relationship between these two characters? The first scene is really engaging and leaves you wondering all these questions, whereas with Immaculate, it's just all too simple and easy. Oh, this girl runs away from the church. Oh, she gets captured and buried alive, and that's it. Okay, the people she's running from are probably evil, and she probably just got in their way or discovered what they're doing. I don't know. It just doesn't leave you totally engaged. Immaculate doesn't pose that many interesting questions, which is the fundamental difference here. It's all what it presents at face value, and that's it. What I really liked about The First Omen is its world building, and how it really does feel like a universe that has been set up outside of the constraints of a horror story. It just doesn't feel like a generic horror film where they just present beat by beat. It really takes its time to build you into the world, and I really like that. See, the film opens with the main character, Margaret, who arrives in Italy, and she's met with these riots and protests occurring in the street. And the priest who comes to greet her, who's played by Bill Nighy, warns her that the streets are becoming dangerous. And this plays out later in the film, such as when Margaret takes the kids from a church to a field trip in the city, and they have to escape as a riot is breaking out. And that's when she starts to see this horror imagery in the riot, and it doesn't feel out of nowhere because we know there is political tension occurring in the film. And this also works because it provides a contrast towards the lovely Italy that she's visited, and that we find out there are some bad things, there are riots going on. But we still get to see that Margaret is fascinated by the culture of Italy, where we get these beautiful establishing shots where she passes the Colosseum and sneaks out to a nightclub with another nun named Lus, and it all feels fleshed out. It doesn't feel constrained. Even adding this other character, Lus, who hasn't taken her vows and is trying to push Margaret to have more fun and freedom before she takes on the life of a nun, is an interesting character addition. In Immaculate, you mostly just get these nuns, and that's it. That's what you get at face value. There isn't much more or anything different or altered to make the story more interesting. I like this little dynamic of this nun trying to push Margaret, who's pretty safe, just trying to stick by the rules of the convent, to go out to nightclubs, to go out and party, and then later in the film, these elements come back. They mean something to the film. So not only is it world building, but it's adding something a little later that adds to the creepiness overall. I really like that for the story structure. Here we get all these different contrasts, like these nuns who strictly abide by the rules and Margaret who wants to follow the path, and that there is this fun-loving nun who doesn't want to hide her body and wants to go out to clubs and have a good time. It adds to the story and adds tension, and it even adds to Margaret feeling uncomfortable and thinks she's seeing something, at the scene in this club. Here we get all these different contrasts. The story just feels more natural when you build on expectations. For example, I thought this movie would be set solely within a convent, like Immaculate was. There wasn't really that much to explore in that world. But the fact that they go outside of this world and explore Italy, it adds so much more to the atmosphere and the world building of the film. It feels like a real place or something that could really happen because we get to see all the different elements, the city, the people who exist there, the riots, the people who are fighting the police, the students of the church, the scared priests, the priests who know something pretty terrible is going on. It just adds more dimension and dynamics, whereas with Halloween or Exorcist Believer, everything that just takes place in that world follows it because it expects you to understand all the movies that came before it. And no certain characters feel like real. They just feel like they're there to serve the plot. In The First Omen, it feels like these characters could actually exist, and there's something more interesting with that. Immaculate is an original horror film. It doesn't belong to any previous IP. It's a story that was built from scratch, but it's still so baseline, so simple, and doesn't do anything with its characters, and it just feels forgettable and silly by comparison, even though these films almost have, beat for beat, the same plot. And lastly, one of the best things about The First Omen is it goes way harder, and the way it's presented, a lot of scary movies don't do this because they just don't have that many scares in them. Like, it almost seems like a broken part of the story if you're going to make a horror film and fill the movie with exposition. You need your scary moments. Like the new Halloween trilogy or Exorcist Believer, there's just so many scenes where we're getting exposition dumps by characters who are explaining why the legacy characters have returned or trying to build out their world, so they forget to be scary and they just spend a lot of time meandering around. Like in Halloween Kills, there was almost no scares for the first hour. It's just getting to know characters, and there's something so boring about that. The First Omen, however, is so atmospherically intriguing and intense that there are these constant lingering moments of dread. And then when something explicitly frightening happens, like when a nun sets herself on fire, it really does kick in, and it really does feel terrifying. And there are many examples of this in The First Omen. The entire atmosphere of the film is dread-inducing, and there are little light moments early on, like when the two nuns go out clubbing, and that almost takes away the tension just for a little bit. But then when they're out of the club and the music gets loud and the lights are flashing and you think you are seeing things in the dark, it goes back to being scary. And every 10 minutes or so, there is a scary moment. And that's one of the best things about The First Omen. It's always leaving you a bit scared. Some horror films don't do this. Some horror films are almost funny now. Like, look at the Scream films. I actually really enjoyed Scream 6 and think that a lot of modern horror films can be good, but sometimes they're just a bit too funny or have great character dynamics that take away from the horror. And while Scream 6 had some really cool kills and overall was a great departure from the rest of the franchise, it still left a bit to be desired as a horror film, whereas The First Omen has a couple of funny moments, but it never forgets to be scary. It never forgets what it's setting out to do. And I do think it's a little unfair to compare this to Scream, because Scream at its core is almost a horror comedy. But I think overall many horror films forget to be scary, and The First Omen knows exactly what it's doing. And it's scary as well. It's always telling a great story, and that's what you need to do. You need to be able to balance those two things perfectly, and this film does it really well. Overall, I really like The First Omen. I think it has great imagery, it's got great structure, it's built in a way that most movies that are horror aren't built. It just has a great story on top of being a horror film, and that's what defines it. You have this great story of a nun coming to another country trying to fit in that merges really well with this horror tale. And on top of that, it just looks great. The imagery is great. There's great tributes to movies like Possession in this film, which is a really underrated film from the 80s that this film explicitly references, but it works because it fits fits wholly into the new story. I really just like this film, and I think that more horror films should do what this film does. Tell a real story. Make it dramatic. Make it as intense as possible. Don't worry about callbacks so much as how you can build your new story. And even though this film does feature like one callback at the very end, it's very brief, it's very quick, and it fits into this film. You could even set a sequel up and it would work perfectly. So overall, I really like this film. I really wish more movies were built like this. Let me know what you guys think. Did you like the first Omen? The acting and everything in here was really great. So guys, let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching this review.